vast and endless sea. You know, because then people will just become self-organizing shipbuilders, right? And I think there's a metaphor for trees here. If you want to save trees, you want to save global forests, don't tell people to save forests. You know, don't try to you know, guilt people into saving the trees. Make them yearn for a culture of forests and forest gardens. That's what I think. So some of what we'll be talking about tonight, we'll be talking about some of those cultures. All right. Oh, very first thing, you know, we talk about trees and their energy interactions. Oh, really? Oh, I love that book. I didn't even make the connection to the name, but that makes perfect sense to me now. You know, I love that book. I even don't remember who the author was. So instead of talking about trees and their energy interactions, that sounds very ecological science. We're going to talk about the superpowers of trees, because these are superpowered beings, in my opinion. By the way, what are some of the superpowers of trees? What are some of the things that trees do for us? Anybody feel like jumping in and naming a few? You can. Why do we want to keep trees around anyway? I mean, do they help transmit Wi-Fi signals? Yeah, they do. Anybody feel like, if you don't feel like talking, you can throw some in chat. We can be talking about these as the ecosystem services of trees. Why do you want to have trees around?
Sequesters carbon.
Yeah, you know, one of the big ones right there, trees sequester carbon. Well, if you want to fight climate change, oh yeah, there are some other good ones. Thank you. Yeah, trees provide shade, they provide food for us, they provide mycelium habitat, so they can grow mushrooms, which are more food. All right, those are a few things we can talk about. You know, and, oh, please.
Terrascapers.
Oh yeah, they're major ecosystem architects, aren't they? They really create the ecosystems. Yeah. Well, we'll talk some more about some more of the superpowers of trees in a second. But if we're going to grow trees, what are some of the things that we need to grow trees? You could add more. You could add more superpowers or some of the needs of trees. We can even do this one together. Oh, that's pretty big. Let's see, what are some of the needs of trees? Oh, those are some of the things they do. They maintain the atmosphere, rehydrate the region. What else was there? Oh, yeah. Oh, they rehydrate the region around the forest. Yeah, very important for water cycles. What are some of the things that trees need if we're going to care for trees? By the way, last class, we ended with this topic of doing an element analysis, talking about the inputs and the outputs of elements in a system, including ourselves. And I invited you to do that as sort of homework. And we'll probably talk about that homework on Wednesday instead of today. So you have another day to do that, to do this kind of element analysis of you in your system. What are your superpowers as a gardener, as an ecosystem architect? And what are your needs in the landscape? And now we're doing that sort of thing with trees. So what are some of the needs that trees have?
Nutritional needs.
Yeah. So we have to care for the nutritional needs of the trees. Let's see if I can make this work. Nutrients. No, we definitely want to make sure that the trees are getting the proper nutrients. Sunlight. Yeah, that they have the correct amount of sunlight. Of course, some like more shade, some like more sun. A lot of our productive trees are going to be happiest if they have more than 8 hours When they're being established, trees need windbreaks. It depends on the trees some. There are trees that are pioneer species, but most studies of trees and tree growth find that if they have some shelter, they can, pretty much any plant. This has been tested with a whole lot of plants. The random number is 1/3. And we'll talk about this on Wednesday when we talk about microclimates. But having shelter and having windbreaks around a system will increase plant growth by about 1/3 and productivity by about 1/3, and a whole wide variety of crops, including a lot of tree crops. They definitely need to be in the right zone, right? They need the right amount of sunlight. A lot of trees are going to need protection. Let's see. Protection from grasses. Grasses are the one the one plant that can really set back rats or tree growth a lot. They can really harm the trees in their early development. So most of the time when we're establishing trees, at least, they need protection from grasses. As the trees mature, they can fend for themselves. But when they're getting established, we need to protect them from grasses. How about deer? If you're going to do plant many trees at all, you're going to have to protect them from critters. Deer and rabbits and voles can do a lot of damage to trees. So if we're going to talk about planting and taking care of trees, we need to think about that. And they need people. Yeah, these days especially, they need people who understand trees and can advocate for them.
Beavers can do a number on trees.
Oh yeah, they really can.
Yeah, 1/2-inch cardboard, half-inch hardware cloth. Bury it in the ground, take it up about 3 feet. That's the only thing ever worked for me. I mean, this was heavy beaver pressure. I mean, these were beavers that could take down a 200-foot cottonwood tree.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for mentioning guilds too. As we think about what the things a tree needs, usually the reason why we're thinking about this and listing them is because we want to be lazy. We want to get other things to do as much of this work for us as we can, which means we're going to need to be thinking about planting things like guilds, right? Planting the trees into ecosystems that will care for them so that they become self-caring. So hopefully all of this sort of stuff, we could talk about pest and disease protection as well. They need pollination usually. So yeah, there are a lot of things that trees need, and as we think about these, the better we can plan for them, the better, the less work we have to do.
I have a question about pollination.
Sure.
Because I understand that when a lot of plants do better when there is a plant of another variety of that exact plant planted near them, and then the pollinators cross-pollinate. And I wonder if you have suggestions about how close together those trees should be to maximize pollination when one is just starting out and just has 2 trees in their backyard, like me. I mean, no, I have lots of trees, but I mean 2 of one particular type.
Unfortunately, there's no really great way to give you an answer to that question, because it depends a lot on the trees. Some trees, but I will say at the end of this class, we're going to talk about selecting trees for tree systems. And one of the things we definitely want to think about is whether or not the trees require pollinators. So when we pick trees, that's one of the things we want to consider, is whether or not the trees are self-fertile and self-pollinating or not. So that, that becomes a pretty big topic, but there are, let's say, a few different categories of trees. One kind of tree is trees that are self-fertile. So for those, you usually only need one. And they say if you have two, it can usually increase the pollination anyway. But what I find is if you get something like, I always recommend Chojuro Asian pear. You've probably heard me say that a million times, because it's one of the trees you can grow with do nothing and get a lot of clean, beautiful grocery store quality fruit with no protection at all. And Chojuro is one of the most disease and pest resistant, and it's self-pollinating. So if you can only have one fruit tree in your yard, Chojuro Asian pear is a great fruit tree. And in my region, working with a lot of clients, no matter what they want to plant, I go to the store and I buy them Asian pears and make them eat them. and then, I say, if you could only plant one fruit tree, Pawpaws in our region or Chojuro Asian pear. So that's one category, is things that are self-fruiting. A second category are things that are bee pollinated, right? So plants that are primarily bee pollinated can be pretty far away from each other. 50 feet is no big deal at all. They'll still have decent pollination. If they're closer, then that's better. For most people, for most fruits, if they're like apples or pears or something, I like to plant them in the same hole. So if you plant 2 or 3 varieties in the same hole, you naturally dwarf them because they'll have a bit of competition, but they'll also eventually pleach together when the trees join to become one tree. That's called pleaching, is the word for that, pleaching. So they'll pleach, and then they share resources. And if one tree gets sick or one tree has damage, the other trees will actually keep that one alive. So, you dwarf them naturally, so you have to do less pruning. You have excellent pollination, and it just works out really great to do that.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly. So now they are selective in terms of what they're looking for. So but 50 feet in a yard is really, you can plant 2 Asian pears in the same hole, absolutely. I haven't found one yet. I've tasted about 10. I haven't found one yet that I like quite as much as Chojuro. That's just my personal favorite. And if you're in a region that has fire blight, Chojuro is the only fire blight immune of the Asian pears. So it could be that in that case, if you plant a couple of them together, the branches on the other one, if you plant 20th century or something like that, might be prone to fire blight, but the Chojuro wouldn't be. So that's one of the reasons why I really like that plant. It's a beautiful landscape tree. It has the best tasting fruit of the Asian pears, in my opinion. It's rich and butterscotchy. And like I said, it's very resistant to diseases. Then the third category, though, are plants that aren't pollinated by bees. So if you're in the tropics, bananas tend to not be pollinated by bees so much. So they like to be in a thicket together, and they'll pollinate better that way. Plums. A lot of plums don't have, I'll answer that in a second. A lot of plums are reliant on flies and things for pollination as well. And so like plums tend to have very low pollination, especially the American species of plums, unless they're in a thicket. They grow naturally in thickets together, so they like that. And part of the reason why is with those branches intercrossing, they have much better pollination. So a lot of plums are good planted densely into thickets with cross-pollination. or multiple plants in the same hole. Pawpaws, if you're planting the American pawpaw, it is fly pollinated, and the even distances of like 20 feet can dramatically reduce pollination. So even at orchards, where people plant pawpaws at recommended orchard spacing, sometimes they'll have poor pollination and they have to be hand pollinated. So if you plant a couple into the same hole, then again, it's naturally a thicket species. They're going to be very healthy and they're going to have excellent pollination. And you can put a compost pile under it to feed them and produce flies so that they have lots. So kind of three broad categories of plants. Let's see here. Where are we at? Chat, I saw a question in the chat. A recommended nursery for it is, you know, the most local. I always recommend the best, most local nursery you can find. In Michigan or the Great Lakes region, Grandpa's Orchard Nursery usually carries Chojuro Asian pear. I was told last year they sold out. Probably because of me recommending it to everybody in the region. But I've visited their operation. It's a really good operation, you know, for an industrial nursery operation. It's one of the best ones I've visited, so I recommend them. You know, but kind of for me, my go-to least worst industrial nursery is Stark. And I know Stark carries Chojuro Asian pear, and I recommend it simply because, you know, it's a big operation. It's not great for the planet, but they send really great stock. So people you're going to be happy with the stock you get from Stark. All right, I love to have little bit of Johnson to things like this. Keeps it interesting. All right. So there are some of the needs of trees. We're going to move on. I'm going to take a picture of that for posterity. Okay. And clear. Okay. So coming back to the superpowers of trees, these are some of the gifts of trees. Some of the reason, this is why we have trees around. This is why we keep the trees. Some of the things that trees do. First, the ecosystem services, or some of the ecosystem services that trees provide, they are water infiltration and purification. In fact, you know, a lot of permaculturists were very interested in swales and water catchments and earthworks. And sometimes you'll watch videos of people and they'll plow swales through existing forests because they want to get more water into the soil in the forest. You don't need to do that. There's tons of research from pretty much every climate and pretty much every biome in the world. And existing forest with a natural understory in most ecosystems have evolved to catch and store and infiltrate about 100%, nearly 100%. You can't say 100% in science, so they say nearly 100% of the water that falls in those biomes. So forests and trees evolved a way to catch and store that water into the soil. Oh, if you run a swale through a forest, all you've done is actually reduced the ability of the trees to catch and infiltrate the water in most cases. Trees are super water infiltration devices. In fact, there's a couple of studies in different climates that show that both oaks and apples will infiltrate a huge amount of water even by year 3. So if you're planting apple trees and you have a naturalistic ground cover down on the ground, by year 3, you don't need your swales anymore. By year 3, those apple trees are infiltrating probably more water in most cases than your swale system would be. So trees are great water harvesting feature. They're air cleaners, of course, and oxygen producers. They're primary energy producers, which means they take energy from the sun and turn it into food for everything else. So in fact, trees do that better than any other plants, which is why trees systems often have the most calories of any systems, and other than water systems, of land-based systems, terrestrial systems, often by like 2 or 3 times. So that means there's more energy for more biodiversity. If you have trees, you necessarily have more biodiversity. They're big ecosystem protectors. We're going to talk about that second. They're resource distributors, and of course, they're soil builders. Trees are some of the best soil builders we have, and they build the soil for all the other beings. And when it comes to people, trees, of course, provide shade and cooling, microclimate control. In fact, a stand of trees can hold enough sun energy and heat in it to moderate the temperature by as much as 15 degrees or more in some cases. But just the density of the wood in a forest can hold enough energy to moderate the temperature by a 15-degree swing. They're crop protectors. They're crop fertilizers. They reach deep down into the soil and mine nutrients and bring them up and drop them in their leaves every year to restore soil fertility. All of the world's most sustainable agricultural systems use the fertility power of trees to grow annual crops. They're water regulators, and of course they provide food, fuel, material, and medicines for people, and they fight crime. It's been proven in multiple studies that having trees and street trees actually measurably and significantly reduces the crime in urban environments. They improve happiness and they improve our mental health. So trees are great to have around. Anyone have anything else that I'm missing here that you'd like to throw in and add to this? Feel free to chime in. You know more superpowers of trees. Oh, no, please.
A long time ago, there was a fellow named Greg Williams who published a journal called Hort Ideas. And he had a debate with a permaculture teacher in a magazine called Whole Earth Review, where he said permaculturists overstated the productivity of forest systems, and an earlier stage of succession was the most productive system, like a meadow system or a shrub system. And he said, once you get to a certain level of a forest, the productivity, well, for humans anyway, is not the best option. And I forget who the permaculturist who argued with him was, but it brought up an interesting discussion. I just wanted to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, it is an interesting discussion. It's true that that there are cases where younger forest systems have a higher annual productivity, and not just even for humans, but in terms of the total calories that they can of sunlight they convert into usable calories for the ecosystem. But than the most mature forests. But looking at savanna ecosystems or younger woodland ecosystems, they're still not as productive than as like a younger and mid-stage forest. So it's really just at the end. And this is also, I would say, my understanding is that I like what that person who is critiquing permaculture said. I think that that person brought up a very good point. And at the same time, science has somewhat moved on from there, because ecologists at that time kind of thought, for example, that there were ecological stages of forest. Like you could say there was a late succession forest, and late succession forest has less overall productivity than mid succession and early succession forest. Now we don't really even think of those terms anymore as a model. We tend to think of forest as always having disturbance. So if you look at forest on a big enough scale, there's always going to be patches where there's fire, there's going to be patches with younger trees. It's not all, there's no natural forest system that's ever going to be that late stage forest that has that reduced succession. Even some of the oldest growth forests we have in the continental United States or in the Pacific Northwest, well, they've been studied, and those natural forest systems have the highest GPP, the highest productivity of pretty much any terrestrial system in North America. So in a way, he's correct that if we compare a younger forest system or even a savanna to a hypothetical old growth forest, they will have higher productivity than the old growth forest. But that old hypothetical old growth forest really doesn't actually exist in the real world. So, you know, it's true. But if you look at even the most productive prairie systems in temperate climates, they're still going to have less than half the gross primary productivity of a forest system. So, but once you move to wetlands have more. Interesting question. I saw another thing in the comments there from Joe. Oh, plums are great for deer crops to distract from what you don't want them to eat. Yeah, that's true. The deer sure will go for them. Here in the Smokies, trees create a specialized atmosphere to protect the forest from high UV rays. Oh yeah, that's true. And it's quite the atmosphere to drive through too. All right. So here's one of these special things. And this is something that one of my students said when discussing this. She said, oh, well, trees were the original socialists, just talking about how trees tend to cooperate more than we think. Like, we're kind of taught this idea that nature is all about competition and fierce competition. But modern science on trees actually shows us a completely different picture of things. What we know now from trees is that trees are in some ways selfish. They look out for themselves and their own health, but they do it in a way that is leaky. And that's the ecological term, leaky. They leak the value and the energy to the beings and the whole ecosystem around them, so that a single tree grows the whole system health and cycles that energy through the whole system. A really interesting thing about trees is that trees maintain a knowledge of pests and diseases and how to fight them. When a pest invades a forest system, trees are amazing chemical factories, and they'll start trying to figure out how to fight that pest. Can they produce a chemical that will poison that pest? Can they turn their sap a flavor that the pest won't like it anymore? Can they manufacture a chemical that will hide the trees and the aroma of the trees so the pest can't find them? The trees will start to experiment and figure out how to fight off that pest. And if the trees can't do it themselves, the trees will start calling on allies. They'll start sending out chemical pheromones, chemical signals to attract different insects until they find an insect that will compete with or eat and predate on that pest. And so trees have a number of tricks that they use for self-defense. And here's the interesting thing. Once one tree figures that out, the tree doesn't use that specialized knowledge to give itself a competitive advantage. That tree actually sends out chemical signals to the other trees and teaches the other trees how to make that same chemical so the other trees can also fight off the pests. That's pretty amazing. And the trees do the same thing for disease issues. As soon as the tree is infected, it starts figuring out how to fight off the disease issue. And this is one of the reasons why old growth trees are so important, because they actually maintain a memory, an immune memory of how to fight off these pests and diseases and what to do when they encounter them. So a forest that has old growth trees in it will learn better and quicker how to respond to pest and disease invasions because of these elder trees and their protection. So the trees actually can teach younger trees how to fight pests and diseases. So saving our old growth trees and our old growth forests, especially in an era of climate change, when we may see resurgences of a lot of different forms of disease, is very important. And one of the reasons why global forests and tree species are so affected by insect and disease pests today is because we've cut down all of the trees, the elder trees, with this knowledge of how to fight pests and diseases. Another interesting thing about trees is if one tree grows in a spot with great rich soil, perhaps it was in a part of the land where the land collected a lot of water and clay and nutrients, and that tree has a ready access to the water and nutrient resources. Again, the trees do not use those resources to say, to only look out for number one. The trees, actually, we know, will create networks and share and distribute the water and fertility resources to other trees. So if one tree is in a high and dry location where it doesn't have access to the water, then the trees will actually send the water and nutrients to that tree. And this is even more fascinating. Trees, have you ever seen apple trees growing in forests in shade and still producing tons of apples? Like, I know a couple of places where there are old apple trees, they're literally in the understory of oaks. And if I plant an apple tree by the side of my house and it's shaded, it will produce like 2 apples and that's it. But here are these apple trees growing on the north sides of forests, getting very little energy of their own, and yet they're very productive. It's because of the large trees are sharing photosynthetic energy with them too. They're not just sharing resources, they're actually sharing sun energy with beings in the forest system that don't have access to the sun. Now, this is a really interesting question. If evolution is survival of the fittest, why would this sort of system evolve? Why would trees help each other make it through pest and disease issues? Why would they share and distribute surplus resources to each other? What is that?
To disprove the theory of evolution. I mean, in order to disprove Darwin.
No, actually, Darwin himself thought that a purely a version of evolution that focused entirely on survival of the fittest was missing how much cooperation there were in ecosystems. But this kind of cooperation actually does give the tree a competitive advantage. How? If you are in a system or a city that has individuals that are undernourished and do not have resources to meet their needs, they will be more susceptible to pest and disease issues, and that weakness affects the whole. So that I, as a wise elder tree, would understand that raising all of the other trees up to a certain level in certain cases will help my own fitness, because if we're all healthier, then we're all healthier. So, yes, there is a certain amount of competition that goes on as well. There's also this sort of wise cooperation that happens in these systems too. And if the trees recognize essentially that we all do better if we all do better, and the ecosystem is healthier as a whole, is the best place for the trees and their progeny into the future to thrive in.
And also, there's a forester, I think her name is Susan Simard, and she recently published a magnificent book. I think it's called The Mother Tree, but I could be wrong. But you can find it if you want to find it. And she figured out by very sophisticated means that the trees do cooperate with the other trees. Yes, that is true. And it's like with all the other trees. However, they also clearly show a preference for their own progeny. And I don't know, I mean, she explains how she did it, and it's like, okay, it sounds like it would work, but I can't tell you what it was because it was too complicated. She's brilliant. She's got there's great stuff on YouTube by her. She's a real sweetheart.
Yeah, it's a great book too. I read it, I think when it came out like a year and a half ago now. Yeah, great stuff. Anyone else have any thoughts or ideas to add to this idea of trees? Now we're really getting to the idea of why we want trees in our agricultural ecosystems and in our city systems as well. Oh, yeah. That's a very interesting point. What are the effects of the practice of municipalities planting male trees only to avoid messy fruiting? Well, for one, there's total overall less GPP, less gross primary productivity, less food for things like birds, and I can understand some extent of it, when it comes to not having street mess. Though I understand it, but we should also be planting, we should be thoughtful about things. We shouldn't only plant a bunch of low quality trees that are male trees that don't produce fruit. It probably has long-term effects on the genetics of the species and on things like disease and pest prevention as well. So that's a really interesting question. I'll have to research that tomorrow. I'm very curious to see if someone has done a research project on answering that question, Melanie. So what are some of the so that was essentially a little bit of an introduction to this chapter in the Permaculture Designer's Manual on trees and their energy interactions. Now, when we include tree-based systems in our agricultural landscapes, we find they do exactly the same things. They can help regulate water to our crops. Of course, if we're smart, we also know that in some cases, they can make it more difficult for our crops to access water resources. So we have to be thoughtful about it. But if it's done well, trees can actually help keep our like annual gardens well hydrated. They can help fertilize systems. This science goes back to some of the earliest Rodale science. Rodale was very interested in how to maintain fertility in organic agricultural systems without any inputs, and whether or not it could be done if we're withdrawing fertility and exporting it as a crop. And they looked at and there's a lot of similar science now on just ecosystems like forests that lose fertility due to leaching downhill and things like this. And they find that the trees are the special feature that bring up a lot of nutrients and keep them cycling, and that it is possible to create agricultural systems without things like nitrogen fixers even, that produce enough fertility out of just the existence of the trees to keep the crop production very high. Now, of course, we can add to that our holistic natural management techniques that we've talked about in our previous classes. Things like using polyculture, using mulches, avoiding tilling. All of those things can produce huge amounts of nutrients within agricultural systems. And walnut perimeters keep grass from moving into sensitive forest systems. Yeah, walnut and actually maples are even more allelopathic to grasses than walnuts. The most allelopathic plant to grasses is probably the Norway maple. In fact, it's rare to go see someone's property. When I started doing this sort of thing, and I was just putting out a shingle as sort of a landscape designer instead of specifically focusing on permaculture, people would always ask me over to visit, and they'd have a maple tree. And they'd ask, what kind of grass can I grow under the maple tree? You can't. It's very difficult to, at least, because that maple is, I've seen people reseed underneath maple trees year after year after year with Eurasian grasses, and they'll look good for about a season, then they die because those maples are extremely toxic to grasses. So yes, trees can be more fortress plants for us. In a few weeks, when we talk about polyculture and gilded design, we're going to go deep into a couple of those big topics, like fortress plant design, using plants to keep grasses out of the garden and other weeds out of the garden as well, and using that as part of our guild matrix. How can we design guilds that really function like ecosystems, including creating a perimeter that maintains the integrity of the guild? That's how we get truly stable guilds. So when we're talking about whole systems, using trees for that can be very important as well. So here's kind of so that was wrapping up this topic of trees and their energy interactions. Next, we're going to turn and focus to the idea of tree systems, starting with home systems, and then looking at community and communal, large acre tree and forest garden systems. But before we do that, since we're going to start talking about home garden or forest garden systems first, and by the way, that's just a little reminder that in the scientific literature, those two terms are used interchangeably, and home garden tends to be used more often in the international literature than the term forest garden or food forest. But for us, they mean essentially the same thing. Home garden tends to be considered by researchers working with global populations to be a more sensitive and politically correct term, and forest garden just sounds cool. So same thing with food forest. A lot of the researchers going out and talking to people shy away from the term food forest because it sounds like it's exoticizing something. That's just the way people have gardens. So it's like, Americans came up with this cool term for just the way people garden. And so they tend to just use the word home garden and explain they're talking about forest gardens. But when you're talking to Americans, it's perfectly fine, in my opinion, to say things like forest gardens and food forests. So in one of our previous classes, we talked about some of the characteristics of the home garden. what are some of those? Can we remember what some of those characteristics are as researchers point them out? And they're also very handy for us to think about designing our own systems. So we're good to talk about. People are
Layers, high biodiversity, flexible productivity, gentle management, climate appropriate, non-even spacing, social uses, and natural succession.
yes, or basically this. It was the next slide, but I like to see if we can engage with this a bit, and just to talk again about a couple of the ones that are going to be most important for today. Yes, high biodiversity. All the systems that we're talking about today are high biodiversity. In fact, some of these systems we'll talk about today are considered to be the most biodiverse systems there are. So these human managed agroforestry systems have the most biodiversity of any ecosystems. There are no wild forests in the world that have as high a biodiversity as the anthropogenic human managed food forest systems, home garden systems, and forest garden systems made by people in their regions. Another one here I want to call back again is this flexible productivity, meaning the point of forest gardens, of these systems we'll talk about today, isn't that they have super high yields for humans. The point of them is that they have enough yields for humans with very, very little energy inputs, and they're like a dimmer switch. If I want more productivity, I can put in more work and labor and energy and turn it up on high, or I can scale it back and turn it down on low and still get good productivity out of the system. So that's one of the big keys of all the systems we'll talk about today. In other words, we talked a little bit in the first class about this Pareto curve, which is or the 80-20 principle, which is very important in practically everything to do with agriculture. So this means, because it's true for most biological systems, it means we get 80% of the benefit out of the first 20% of our action. So as we said before, there's research that shows if you're doing weeding work, you'll get 80% of the improvement to yield from the first 20% of the weeding work you do. If we're talking about pests or disease management, you get 80% of the benefit of those from the first 20% of the work. If you're talking about most issues having to do with labor, almost all of them. In fact, this has been studied and very well understood, even by like Karl Marx wrote about this. So this has been understood for hundreds of years, that that labor in agricultural systems follows the Pareto curve. So we get 80% of our return of our yields from the first 20% of the labor we do. So the point of all of these systems is that they stay right there in that green box. All of these forest gardening systems are very labor efficient. They have very high returns for the amount of labor we do on them. So most of our industrial agriculture systems are way up in that red. We're using tons of fossil fuels, tons of energy, tons of poisons, only to get another 2 or 3% extra yield out of the system. And that's why the agricultural labor in the United States is locked down at about $3 an hour. By the way, when was the last time the United States had a raise in the agricultural minimum wage? I think it was 1969. It was $3 an hour. And in every minimum wage bill since then, agriculture has been exempt. And so there are studies that show, even today, people doing most agricultural work are still making about $3 an hour. So the same rate that they made back in 1969. So, and so that's, these two reasons together are why we need a completely different paradigm for how we do land-based businesses, because we have to stay out of that red. We got to stay in the green, and we have to avoid doing work that other people are doing for $3 an hour, because it's, that kind of work is just completely destroyed by frankly, government interference. So the point of these systems is that they return a lot for the little amount of work that we have to do. And part of the reason why is because they work with ecological succession. The fact that ecosystems grow in diversity, in abundance over time. So they naturally grow more wealth, more abundance over time without doing any work to make that additional abundance and yield happen, right? So that's kind of the magic of these systems. We're going to come back. Let's take a break for 10. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about some of the world's home garden systems, home forest garden systems, and then we're going to talk about some of the communal systems and common systems, broader acre systems in the world. All right. If you have any questions about any of this, you can think of them now. We'll be back and we're going to start today. We're going to take like an 8-minute break, if that's okay. We're going to come back and start again at 7:10. All right. See you in 8 minutes.
All right, now I can be free to chat with you all on the stream. Thank you all for joining. And thanks all for your comments. It's been a really great discussion. We've gotten a little bit sidetracked onto the question of energy and whether or not nuclear energy is a viable way to solve climate change, to, replace fossil fuels with. And just real quickly, my position is that definitely nuclear is better than fossil fuels, but there are so many barriers to it that it's not really going to be a viable way to replace the energy. And in fact, nothing really will. I mean, we could deploy all the renewable energy that we can manufacture. We could put all of our efforts towards that, have a new war effort. And as long as our energy consumption continues to go up, which kind of has plateaued a little bit, but still continues to go up overall, it can never be enough. I think what we're facing is the fact that at some point the question has to be, what can we do without? How can we reduce our energy consumption? And there are ways to do that with things like geothermal power, especially when you consider that one of the leading draws on energy is just heating water, not even to necessarily steam powered levels, but just for powering a radiator to heat a home or to cook food with, that sort of thing. A lot of our energy consumption goes to that, and that can be substantially reduced with things like solar water heaters, ground source heat pumps, that sort of thing. These are technologies that we should be looking at more than anything. Technologies that allow us to use less energy overall, use less electricity as well. So we also have the global supply system, the just-in-time delivery system that has products moving continuously across the country, around the world. The idea that because of capitalism, it is the cheapest option somehow to say, grow fruit in one part of the world, ship it across an entire ocean to be packaged, and then back to a third continent to be distributed and consumed is just mind-boggling. The amount of energy wasted to do very simple things just because, you know, labor's cheap here or labor's cheap there, and we have to always exploit the cheapest labor in order to turn a profit. These are things that first and foremost need to be rethought if we're going to address the energy crisis and address global warming at the same time, because they're very much linked. But I do appreciate the discussion. I'm trying to keep up with what people are saying. How are people feeling about this presentation so far? A lot of really interesting ideas about trees, all the services they provide for free. And just think about that too. We could, you know, spend tons and tons of energy heating and cooling homes, or we could reduce the amount of energy that's needed by growing more trees and more plant materials, and being smart about the way that we do windows, you know, employing passive solar. That's a fantastic way to reduce your energy needs. But usually for every technological solution, there are much more low energy solutions that also have other benefits when you're looking at an ecological solution. So yeah, and also this is a big another big component is the planning of our cities, the way we configure things, just having more walkable neighborhoods so we use less energy, having more food grown within city limits without you know, making agricultural skyscrapers. I think those things are not a good deployment of scarce resources and energy. But just like, you know, say a lot of people have a small outdoor space, a balcony or a patio, growing just a few bits of your food there. At the same time, it saves you money. Same time, it provides some health benefits as well, having fresh fruit and vegetables available to you. So yeah, having more mass transit, another great way to reduce the amount of energy needed in the first place. A lot of our energy is think about how much is just wasted in traffic jams. Every major city has traffic jams.
Recording stopped.
So it'd be great if there was one silver bullet that we could just say, do this, and we'll solve global warming, we'll solve the energy crisis, everyone will be happy. But there's so many other problems that are all human caused that go along with that, but aren't directly related to energy either. There's the manufacturing of disposable crap that is damaging at every stage of the process, serves no real function. It's just the cheapest thing to do because that's what capitalism always pushes towards, is the cheapest, not necessarily the best. And then causes ecological damage after it's been disposed of for, you know, tens of years, hundreds of years. It really depends on the plastic product. But plastic especially is incredibly damaging. So there's that. There's the way that we do agriculture, where we're not very careful about the way farms are planned. So we don't, you know, set aside space that is, you know, delicate land that could be easily degraded, or that could have manure and other fertilizers run off easily from it. We don't think about that ahead of time, or incentivize farmers to not farm parts of their land that are ecologically sensitive. This leads to a crisis of many crises, actually. This is what causes dead zones in, say, the Gulf of Mexico and other river deltas. This is what causes a crisis of manufacturing enough phosphorus. You may not be aware there's a global phosphorus crisis because farmers put phosphorus, they just pour it onto the land and it washes out without a
Well,
care.
I'm back a minute early. You don't have to come back just yet. I'm back. And speaking of tree services, my lemon tree is not quite out of lemons yet. So I still have two left. Two last lemons after tonight. It's going to be a sad, sad day. I'm out of lemons. Because then all I've got left are sun chokes. in the pantry, maybe a few crones. I pickle some crones, put those in my water. That sounds gross. Why would I do that? Ooh, sunchoke water? That sounds disgusting.
That
So,
actually does sound disgusting.
You know.
They taste like potatoes for those that haven't sampled it.
You know, this is a fun day to be talking about trees and tree crops because I just made a couple of my last orders of trees for my system, my new project, yesterday. So this has very much been on my mind. When we get later on in the class, we're going to kind of talk about selecting trees. So we'll talk about that sort of thing. Anyway, we looked at this picture before, one of my very favorites. So now we're going to really get into the home garden pattern of humanity. And here again is this lovely illustration from the study Home Gardens in Nepal, which shows the cellular structure of the home forest garden surrounded by hedgerow and tree crop systems, agroforestry systems with spaces for annual crops, both inside and outside the enclosure, different enclosures for animals. The classic system right there. I love this illustration of it. Of course, you know, my sort of version in my book for modern Americans looks like this. Again, what we might import to the American suburbs has many of the same features, being surrounded by hedgerow, having intensive garden in it, having agroforest areas, different ecosystems all together. This is kind of that classic home garden pattern found around the world. It's an amazing kind of pattern that we see everywhere. And just a reminder, we talked about it before, but all of these systems, especially in temperate climates, have an open center, and the number again is 2 acres. If you're talking about standard sized trees, in order to get enough light infiltration into the center to grow annual crops, you need a 2 acre size clearing. Or you need smaller trees. So if you're only using small trees, then maybe you only need like an acre or even a quarter of an acre if they're small trees or bushes. But once we have standard sized trees, to get enough sun infiltration into the system, to get that 8 to 10 hours of sun for like tomatoes and peppers, we need 2 acres. Oh, just always good to keep in mind. And that happens to be about the size that we see in a lot of these systems. If you go back to this picture, this little illustration is fantastic because it shows the common pattern of taller standard trees and forest in the back. Usually, that's going to be the side away from the sun, which is usually the windy, cold side. So those taller trees provide shelter, they provide fuel wood, and then the shorter trees and hedgerows to the front, so there's good light infiltration to the sun side. So the classic sun trap design that we see in forest gardens is right there in that pattern in Nepal. I love that they did that. And again, these systems are found around the world. One of the reasons why we try to introduce these is to get people thinking in patterns first. So what I would like to invite you to do, and if you have my book, you notice that this is in the book too, that one of the first things that we're trying to do is try to think of an overall theme, a conception, a way of viewing what we want our projects to be like. Usually all of the other details will flow from having this overall pattern in our minds. So as I cover things here, if there's something interesting to you, I'll invite you to make that homework for yourself. You can go out and research it, learn some more, be inspired by these patterns. In a few weeks, we'll talk about some of the aesthetic patterns that go with some of these things. For example, the classic cottage garden is now recognized as a home garden style. And I love this particular painting of the cottage garden because it looks so much like that illustration from home gardens in Nepal. It has very much the same sort of idea. Now, a lot of us are familiar with the cottage garden concept, at least some. You know, we know that it's a profusion of wild flowers, often weeds, grown together, not in rows, but in dense plantings that look very wild, of flowers mixed with vegetables, herbs, perennial vegetables. You gotta have an apple tree in there, a Bramley apple, or perhaps a pear, and of course, enclosures for wildlife or for like chickens are very common as well. So the cottage garden itself goes, yeah, absolutely. Happy trees. These are, it's a fantastic little painting there. And no mistakes in that one. If there's a mistake, you can turn it into an apple tree. So, but this, you derailed me with some, with an art reference. And so with this system is of course ancient, but it's had a big revival around the late Victorian era and into the 1920s or so, and it was inspired a lot by the pre-Raphaelite artists and this idea of reviving this sort of an older, more just and sustainable way of life. And the artists, the gardeners who did this cottage garden revival were very aware they were making sustainable gardens. They were aware that they were doing something that was good for wildlife, and they were aware that it used less. Now, the way they thought of it in terms of sustainability is less oppressed labor. You know, they were trying to, they had this understanding a lot of manor estates required vast armies of servants. And these cottage gardens were wilder and took care of themselves, so they did not require people to have servants to maintain and have nice gardens. But these gardens have a long history and were practically the same everywhere in medieval Europe. So this is an illustration of a medieval manor, what was called the three-field system. So in a medieval manor town, you would usually have a strip where the peasants, the workers lived, the agricultural peasants lived. Then that's kind of blown out on the right. And that system was called the Toft and Croft system. Everybody had their own little cottage, and they had a field that they could use as well. And the cottage, the Toft part, was a cottage garden, and they usually had a couple of fruit trees, herbs. They had probably an area for chickens, and it was the classic home garden pattern. And then they also had a field. Usually their field was enclosed in hedgerows, so that it was protected as well. And so it's practically everybody had their own little forest garden system. Then the whole community together had a system of commons, pasture, of woodland, of coppice lots for fuel wood, a meadow, and they would have 3 different fields that they would cycle through. So they could allow one to fallow and move on to these other fields. So very, very ancient system. If you want to see a kind of a modern version where gardeners, historic gardeners try to recreate this, you can Google the Chelsea Pensioners Garden. It was a prize-winning garden for the Chelsea Flower Show one year. that was based on this kind of historic cottage garden. And as you see here, that's a little forest garden. I see elderberries up front. I see brambles. I see lots of different vegetables and flowers all mixed in together. So it's a classic pattern for us. And one of the reasons why I like to point out these sorts of gardens is a lot of people deal with issues with the neighbors. We want to make ecologically sound gardens that grow food for ourselves. The neighbors want us to have lawns. So the cottage garden as an aesthetic allows us to do something that meets our needs, yet it can communicate an aesthetic to the neighbors. It's a way of packaging up our food forests and selling them to the neighbors in ways that they don't hate. Another version of this is in France. They also had very similar sorts of gardens, but a specialized version of the cottage garden called the Jardin de Curé. There should be an accent aigu over the E, but I couldn't figure out how to do that. So this is Jardin de Cure. You know, I kind of feel like Robert Smith of The Cure would dig this. So, so this is Jardin de Curé, and it's a form of forest garden, again, that integrated in tree crops and vegetables and fruits and herbs in wild plantings, but in formalized looking rows, so that it would look like Versailles or something like that. Yet it still had the manageability of a wilder home garden or forest garden. As you can see, the enclosure with the multi-use hedgerows in the background again. And that was, of course, the model for the gardens. My last project, Lily House, was a true permaculture jardin de curé with all the permaculture stuff like water harvesting and all of that, but following the aesthetic rules of this ancient form of forest garden. You know, the Jardin de Curé, in a way, could have been, you know, sort of the first permaculture garden, in that it was, well, probably not the first, but one of the original versions of it, and that it was designed to be very easy and to integrate food, fuel, fruit, and medicine all into one. Another one that has become quite popular in a lot of our communities are the Russian Dasha gardens. And these are summer home gardens, and they're kind of the same exact thing. These had a sort of indigenous Russian peasant origin to them in their history, which is fascinating to talk about, which maybe we'll get into at some other time. But these gardens kind of revive a very old form of Russian cottage gardening. And again, you can see the exact same mix of fruits and vegetables and flowers and herbs all together into semi-wild plantings, because these were essentially summer home gardens. They were places meant for people to visit, not be out there in the garden every day for 7 hours maintaining it, right? So they had to be naturalistic. They had to work with nature. They had to integrate in wild to make these things, to make them easy. And so again, they're this beautiful profusion of folk gardening with our favorite fruits, our favorite flowers, our favorite vegetables, some areas for bringing in some summer income. And the magic of these gardens is that they're providing, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, these home summer gardens, these Dasha gardens, stepped up and produced about 40% of the food for Russia. And they did this on a tiny amount of time. Think about that. They produced, a lot of these gardens were producing most of the food for the people who gardened and enough to sell that they were producing 40% of Russia's food, and the average amount of time people were spending on these was just 2 hours a day. A lot of them were probably doing lily house. You know, I've told you before, lily house I was using about 2.5 hours a week. There were times when it was higher than that, but you know, on average 2.5 hours a week. And these Dasha gardens were producing the same thing. All of these systems we're talking about today, all of them are based on lifeways where people were basically working about 12 hours a week max in a lot of cases for all of their work. So they were producing all their society's food using systems like this on a very small amount of time. Oh, keep that in mind when you hear people saying, we can't feed ourselves, we need industrial agriculture because growing food is such hard work. If we have to grow our own food, there's no way Americans will do it. They'll take 60 hours a week to, you know, it doesn't take a ton of land or time to be able to grow a whole lot of our food if we're doing it in systems that look like this. Now, why we call them forest gardens is when we add up all these systems together and we look at it like this. This looks like a village, a human settlement inside a forest. We see a young tree forest system integrated in to the larger forest system. And so what we see when we look at this is kind of like what Noah was talking about earlier, not late succession forests. So when we permaculturists are romanticizing the productivity of forests, we're not talking about dense, you know, mature end stage forests. We're talking about this kind of forest. Okay, so, and again, I just threw this one in here. I know we saw it before, but I like to throw it in here because it's a master class in one image. Okay. Does anyone have any thoughts or comments about those home systems? Now, I would give you two if you want to have a traditional theme. I have a few more in my book, but I'll give you those two as two great aesthetic paradigms for people to develop home permaculture gardens, the Cottage Garden and the Jardin de Curé. And both of them are great for historic neighborhoods, because you want to make the historic neighborhood people happy, you can do a historic form of garden. The Jardin de Curé was a huge fad at the time when Lily House was built in the 1850s. So, but even 1950s homes, post-war homes, were actually built with these cottage gardens in mind at the time. They were a fad then too. People were coming home from war. People wanted to have little gardens. People were selling these Sears Roebuck homes with images of the cottage garden around them, with, of course, the pink flamingo. Why are there pink flamingos in cottage gardens in North America? It makes no sense. But that's what people wanted. So we give the people the pink flamingos. Anyone have thoughts or comments about them? Okay. Well, we're going to keep on going here for as long as I can. In a little bit, it looks like my, let me see if I can sign in. Okay. All right. Well, let's continue on here. Let's see. Let's look at commons systems. So these are systems for broader acre. And for a lot of you who I'm hoping are going to go out and become the professionals in transforming your communities and rebuilding these kinds of systems, knowing about these systems can be really powerful guidelines to help us design better systems for our communities. And let me check that chat. Looks like I see something in the chat. Oh, just happy trees again. All right. Noah mentioned, so this system again is a traditional agroforest system This one is in Gilgit-Baltistan, or the Hunza Valley. And this is a traditional lifeway based on the apricot primarily. Though they also had walnuts and apples and pears, but the apricot and its sweet pit, like an almond, were the main crop that this area lived off of. And the people here were primarily vegetarian. So this is and they're the oldest lived people on Earth. So some of that has been questioned recently a little bit, but more people going back to look at the actual data are finding, yes, these are still some, it wasn't as miraculous as some people claimed, but they're still amongst the oldest lived, healthiest people on Earth with their forest gardening diet system. And we see this again, this what we call Mosaic Landscape, a mix of tree crop systems that fertilize field systems that are all still intermixed with trees and tree crops. So, and we know that these mosaic woodland systems are amazing at stewarding species as well. I think I have the link on there for this study. Oh, I didn't include the link. I'll throw it up in the Transformative Adventures Facebook group. Just an image showing how much more, this one is from Switzerland, showing how much more biodiversity the traditional mosaic woodland these are, by the way, these are called mosaic forest and mosaic woodlands. So again, a form of forest that, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just looking. Oh, you're talking about Gilgit-Baltistan, Hunza Valley. Yes. Again, like in a lot of these systems, you'll see their hillside, and they irrigate, essentially, they fertigate the soils below. So very interesting systems. So here we see some of the apricots in blossom time. This integration again of fruit trees and fields. You'll see natural water harvesting features in their fields as well. You see some of them are using, talk about maximizing edge effect. This is an amazing integrated forest gardening cropping system. Just absolutely amazing to look at. And so the systems, everybody has their home and their home garden, and they have, and then they have the commons, which include a lot of these apricot areas and hedgerows with apricots. And these are kind of collectively managed. So people have their own home and their home gardens, like the Toft and Croft system again. And they have commons that they manage together. And a lot of these are done as micro enterprises. And people will go out with their families or by themselves to do some of it. And then they come together and they work communally. It's kind of the best of both worlds. You don't have a boss, you're your own boss. You have your own micro enterprise, you work when you feel like it, but you can also do it in a way that's casual and life enhancing. And we get together with friends and we can process things. It's a very common arrangement for work in these systems all around the world. Now, I like to point this out because it's very different than some of our hippie ideals about what these systems should work like. The kind of American hippie way to do it is, I want to start a nonprofit. I'm going to be the president of the nonprofit. I'm going to start a food forest. Y'all need to come and volunteer at my food forest. And also give me donations to pay for it. And I'm going to boss everybody around and get really burned out and disappointed when everybody doesn't want to do what I say. And okay, I hope that we do a lot better than that, but I've seen far too much of that. The systems that we're looking at here often have a communal ownership and communal management of the whole system, but people create their own sort of little micro enterprises within them, and they cooperate and they collaborate, but they're still, self-owned, self-operated kinds of businesses, and they get together and they work together, so they have the best of both worlds. But there's no sort of top-down management like we often try to create. And just an interesting rule for us to think about as we look forward. And when we talk about designing human-based systems and community organizing in a few weeks, or March, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about designing systems that make sense with the ecology of cooperation. And it's not the way we do it here. It's the way they're doing it there in that picture. Another great model for this, of course, is in a similar region, is the Kyrgyz apple walnut forest. They're called apple walnut forests. Those are the dominant species. But there was a recent study there that went and found a bunch of amazing rare pear varieties too. There are plums there. Apricots are another big part of these as well. And they're just, for a long time, we looked at them and thought they were just wild forests that happen to grow a lot of apples and walnuts. Now we understand they're semi-managed anthropogenic systems that are rich forests with walnuts and apples intermixed. And they're the same way. They're based on, the forests are managed and often owned collectively, but people get together and they build little micro enterprises. You have a little cart, you go and take things to market, and they're very flexible in terms of how they do that. So the rule I like to say is build systems to support people. Don't try to build systems that require people to support them. The Kyrgyz apple walnut forests and the Hunza apricot forests, these systems are there and they're very useful to people, so people use them. It's as simple as that. Again, micro enterprises, lots of medicinals in them, foraged foods, pork, fruits for local markets, fruits and nuts for value added products. A lot of this is focused on value added again. Just some more pictures to show. Again, we have, you can see the small houses, cottage gardens with the forest garden, the home garden pattern, little forest gardens of super high biodiversity within a region of super high biodiversity. By the way, these forests are known to be super high biodiversity hotspots. And in fact, there's a challenge between, government officials and university extension agents trying to get these people to industrialize their agriculture, and ecologists saying, we need these biodiversity systems to save species. And they provide a lot of life benefits to the people who live here. The Hunza Valley's in Pakistan, by the way, and they just passed another law trying to get people to work to receive government benefits. You have to work like 40 hours a week. They have a lot of trouble getting people in these forest gardening culture regions to actually go and work a job for 40 hours because their whole lifestyle was built off of a life where they worked about 12, 15 hours a week. And yet, they had a very prosperous lifestyle. Were some of the longest lived people on the planet and had very high literacy rates. And, the World Health Organization, the World Bank calls these people in poverty. They say, oh, the poor people who live there, they don't have any cash money. They live in poverty. These are the wealthiest people on the planet. We want to take their land away from them and make them work in factories, so we call them poor. Then we can claim that we saved them from their poverty by giving them factory jobs. Just another picture from the apple walnut forest. We got a similar thing in Spain. As Spain industrialized, these went out of fashion for a while. Now they're really making a resurgence. There's a great couple of little videos I posted in the Transformative Adventures group. These, in Spain, a lot of these were, some of them were owned by individuals, and some of them had aristocratic ownership going back forever. But there's a lot of models of dehesas in Spain and in Portugal that are, and they're also called montados, that are cooperatively owned. And the major species tend to be cork and cork products from the trees. So they're used as agroforestry products, but they're also for pork, raised bulls, beef and dairy, mushrooms and foraged products. A lot of foraged spring vegetables and mushrooms come out of the dehesas. Value-added products are a major part of them. Craft products are a major part of the dehesa way of life. And these are coming back, and they're sustaining whole communities in parts of rural Spain and Portugal where people have pretty much left. So they're rebuilding this forest gardening lifestyle. And I can't not talk about eastern woodland. Here, I'm in Indiana. One of the best models that we have is this, the Eastern Woodland model. This is pictures at Turkey Run. And it's an amazing place to visit because it's one of the only places in the eastern half of the United States that wasn't logged, And so it's a sizable stand that's of original growth. And so when you get into this, you can stand around and find places in this forest, and 95% of the plants around you will be edible. You'll stand around and you can see pawpaws and persimmons in the overstories, brambleberries wherever there are clearings, elderberries, blackberries and black raspberries everywhere, walnuts and hickories and pecans, especially hickories and pecans in the overstory. There's service berries throughout, different viburnum species in the understory. There's tons of what we call fairy spuds, which used to be traded as currency. Claytonia virginica, an amazing little chestnut flavored tuber that's just fantastic to eat. They're so good. Ramps, of course, everywhere. So you get into this place, and it is a true food forest. And this was definitely an anthropogenic system created by our First Nations. It's great to get in there and see them. We don't have records for how they were managed the way we do with these European systems, but still amazing to get in and see these historic systems. I know I'm going through a lot really quickly. I'm just kind of trying to get through this section. But does anyone have any thoughts or comments or questions, things to add? I did see a couple things in the chat. Oh, yeah, cool. The Okanagan region in Washington State. Yeah, more Native American food forest. We had these systems. We just essentially, punished our First Nations peoples for maintaining these systems, and we kicked them off, any of them that we could. A lot of them in the Eastern Woodland region, we don't, at this point, there aren't many people who claim to know how these systems were managed. We have some records, but not a lot. The West Coast, we have more, so it's great we can learn from those.
The pronunciation is Okanagan.
Okanagan, thank you.
Yeah, sure. That way more people know what you're talking about.
Yeah, what did I say?
Okanagan.
Oh.
I mean, it's not that bad, but it's just that more people will recognize it.
I appreciate that. Thank
and
you.
Of course, it's kind of a center of hippie revival of permaculture too.
Oh, cool.
Michael Pilarski.
Oh, of course.
Although he doesn't live there anymore, but.
Oh, I didn't know that either.
Yeah, he lives in Port Townsend, which is another. Well, anyway, we're getting distracted. He picks his locations very wisely.
Huh. Oh, cool. Yeah, we'll finish up a few more of these, then we can kind of talk about some things they have in common after a break. These are kid critters playing in a European Toft system. And this is a traditional mosaic landscape or forest garden system of the German-speaking countries. And there's another picture of one. We saw it in one of our previous classes. We talked about these. Again, fruits, they tended to emphasize fruits that would grow clean naturally in the region because these systems were systems that weren't meant to be sprayed. So they didn't just plant. They didn't go to the store and just buy whatever fruit trees are at Walmart. They didn't just go and buy a bunch of gala apples or whatever. They planted historic apple varieties that grew in their area, and pears and plums, things that could grow well without a lot of critters in them, you know. We could talk too about shifting cultivation in the tropics as a form, slash and burn, where they would typically slash one area of forest and move on to the next and slash that and use it for crops and move on to the next and slash that. Oh, that's awesome. Thanks, Noah. And so these kinds of systems too are, for a while they had a bad rap. Europeans would look at them and say this was bad. But now we've looked at them and we understand this is an infinitely sustainable system. Hey, you can also see nurse logs in there. They're doing logs on contour to prevent erosion. And this is a great picture because you can see the foreground, a younger crop area. And in the background, you can see younger forest crops just starting to get established. And so usually these were on like a 7-year or 10-year rotation. 7 was really common, where they'd strip a 1 acre, again, enough size to get in light infiltration, and move to the next, strip an acre, move to the next. We'll just throw in a few last ones here before we take a break. In Japan, they had the Sarayama system. Like I've said, we have these systems we can learn from and study pretty much everywhere humans could grow trees. These are just some of the ones that have been most studied. So the Saroyama is the boundary between the mountain forest and the human forest. It's a metaphor for the land in between the true wild and the human system. And these were considered to be, very agriculturally productive, very powerful spaces. Yes, Fukuoka's forest garden was a Sarayama system.
Oh, okay.
So, we can see it in something like this. This is from my neighbor Totoro. These Sarayama systems became very endangered in Japanese culture. And Miyazaki used them as a metaphor in a lot of his movies to represent that boundary between the old and the wild and the new. So these Sarayamas feature very prominently in a lot of Miyazaki's cartoons. Now, that's exactly what we see in a lot of these images. Okay, well, does anyone have any thoughts or questions or comments about any of those? We're going to take a break in a minute. I just want to see if anyone wants to add anything before we do. We'll come back and we'll talk about what lessons we can take from all of these different kinds of systems. What do they have in mind? What do they have in common? What can we learn from them? Because if we're going to be really smart designers, we do well to copy old, evolved systems that have lasted millennia. I know I see you want to say something.
This is for one of your upcoming slides. Do you have any recommendation for a detailed guidebook on how to create edible tapestry hedgerows? Because it's a very important subject and your book discusses it, but I feel it could be elaborated upon.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that when we get to it, and we can go into some more depth in this class on it. And then when we do our polycultures design class, we'll go into even more depth. It would make an excellent whole book on its own. And Melanie, did you want to add something too?
Oh, I just wanted to say how much I appreciate all of the diversity of examples of when historically humans have lived in this way, because we're working on a project trying to get neighbors to convert, and I feel like when we only use the indigenous Native American examples, there's a tension there, right? About if people don't come from those cultures or they don't relate to it so much. But this really gives me a lot of information and different things to look into. And I bet that everybody could reach back into their ancestral past and find examples of, when your ancestors might have lived like this. And I just feel really encouraged by that, and really, like I have a lot more examples. So I'm very appreciative of all of the examples that you've given.
Funny you
Good.
should say that, because we were just looking up to see if there were any, like what the word is for a traditional Scottish or Irish forest garden.
Yeah.
The Toft and Croft system was coming. By the way, I might get cut off here. I'm trying to log into a different computer and I'm having some difficulty. If we do and you get kicked off, come back in 10 minutes and we'll restart, okay? There's a small possibility I'm going to get kicked off before I can manage to log back in. In fact, I'm going to stop my video. That might last just a second longer. And actually, for my benefit, let's take a break and come back at 8 o'clock, and we'll continue this discussion, including looking at traditional models from around the world, including places like Scotland. I have a few thoughts about that. We'll get back to it, okay? See you again in 10 or 8 minutes.
All right. I will have my phone with me so I can keep tabs on the chat and whatnot. But I need to go start making some food for myself. I just went straight from work to streaming, so yeah, I just won't be able to respond to you with the microphone until I get back. But yeah, feel free to comment. I'll be able to see it. Oh, and just a note in case anyone has joined recently, this is a live stream of a permaculture class. We're sitting in on the Zoom call. It's something we do many Mondays, not every single Monday, but a lot of them. Mike Hogue of Transformative Adventures Permaculture has been nice enough to let us in on this kind of sneak peek of his permaculture design class. So that's what we're watching right now. All right, I'll be right back.
Recording in progress. Recording stopped.
Okay, I'm back for a little bit here. I'll have to duck out in a little bit more to keep preparing my food, but for now anyway. I do not have a cord. Oh. I love the movie My Neighbor Totoro. It's my favorite Miyazaki, even though it has it's the least formatted like a traditional story. There's no big bad guy to fight. No one really fights anybody. It's just kind of about reconnecting with the earth. Yeah, what a great movie. That's a still from it right there that we're looking at. Oh, that's someone else. Who's not muted their mic. That's why every time I come into a Zoom call, I come in muted. Just as a default. You never know what it's going to pick up on. But yeah, this is good stuff so far. I'm really enjoying this class in particular. Trees are kind of one of those things in permaculture that get a lot of attention and reverence, and for good reason. I mean, we went through that slide about all the different services they provide ecologically and as well as to people. They're kind of the cornerstone to a lot of permaculture designs. I don't know if we'll have the privilege of covering the polyculture class, but that's when we get into tree guilds. And that's the idea that certain plants do well with one another. You may be familiar with like the Three Sisters, where you have corn, beans, and squash all planted together. Corn acts as a pole for the beans. The beans fix nitrogen, which corn is an incredibly high nitrogen feeder. Takes a lot of nitrogen to grow corn. So those two have that symbiosis. And then the squash spreads out across the ground and fills in all the gaps, prevents rain from packing down the soil too hard, keeps things cooler, so less water is needed by the plants. And then of course you get a crop from it as well. And it also benefits from the nitrogen from the beans as well. So that's one example of a polyculture, but you can get very complex, and a lot of them center around trees. Like you'll have a walnut guild or a cherry tree guild. And basically it's named by whatever species you're putting as your centerpiece, like your workhorse usually. You could have a chestnut guild if you have a chestnut that is viable. And then you kind of select other species that do well with that main one. That's the idea of polyculture and tree guilds in specific. So that'd be cool if we get to do that one, but I'm not sure yet. Mike hasn't given me the full schedule of stuff he's gonna let me stream yet, so we'll see. I'll keep you all posted. But it looks like it's gonna be most Mondays, so whatever the Monday class is will be something that we'll be able to get in on, which is pretty cool. Pretty cool. I'm thinking myself of trying to put together a permaculture design course that I can offer to, well, all of you, that I would ideally teach over this stream to all the different places I usually do. And that way anyone can participate, but of course priority will go to people that are paying class members. And of course the only ones conferred certificates at the end of it would be the paying class members, but the knowledge itself would be put out for everyone. I like that balance. It's a balance between access and, I guess transaction, really. And that way too, one of the things I always, I'll get back to it later. Looks like Mike's coming back. I'll finish that thought later though.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? I have changed names, but I'm still me, don't worry. Got a slightly
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. All right.
Yes.
All right. Good. Okay.
Oh boy. Switching the view there.
Oh,
Go back.
we
full
lost the slideshow. I'm gonna have to find that again in a second. So yeah, what were we were talking about these different systems around the world, and just good to know that there are so many different examples, and that's really true. And there are inspiring examples that match our own backgrounds, and I think those are fantastic to look into. There are some interesting books out there. In my book, I mentioned them. I have a little resource page on traditional African American gardens, because like a lot of the post-Civil War, or African American gardens that were being built were essentially like forest gardens too. Again, and before we took the land back away from them and kicked them off, a lot of those gardens were that sort of garden too. So there are so many ways we can build these kinds of gardens that really work for us. So I appreciate that that is appreciated. It looks like Melanie may have had to take off.
Oh, shit.
Oh.
Recording in progress.
Oh, excellent. So now we are back. Does anyone have any other thoughts or comments about these systems that we looked at over the last hour? Yeah, Noah.
There's a guy in Australia, Angelo Iliades, who pruned deep green permaculture. He uses a system where he prunes his trees like 3 times a year. And he's sort of a short fellow like myself. So he keeps all the fruit trees at a very low height, reachable by somebody who's about 5'4". And he's in a suburban area, and it makes it hard for the fruit bats in the neighborhood to come down that low, because they don't like to be so low near creatures like Homo sapiens. So, and there's a book related to that, I forget the name, about pruning all your fruit trees to be like a dwarfing size, and standard fruit trees keep everything often out of reach and out of control of human beings. So what do you think about those concepts?
I like them very much. Another one that works very well with it is called backyard orchard culture. And that there's a system, I think, with PDF you can find out there on backyard orchard culture. And it again uses interplantings of like three or four trees in the same hole, so that it naturally dwarfs them and keeps them easier to prune. And then, yeah, you do aggressive pruning, keep them small. I very much like that. I very much recommend it. So, yeah, so that's a great time to mention that. Thanks for bringing it up. Have you done that before? Has anyone else done that before? I like to keep most of my fruit trees fairly small too, unless there's a reason for them to be big. In a bit, we'll talk about choosing fruit trees, and one of the things that we'll break them down into a few different categories of tree that we want. And one of those categories is like, our intensive fruit trees, those things that like apples and pears and, a lot of the major mangoes, most of the major grocery store fruits. These tend to take a lot of time and energy to care for. Then we have another category, which I would call extensive. And extensive fruit trees are really super easy. They mostly take care of themselves. The other thing with the intensive fruit trees is if you don't manage them, if you don't get to them, they can create a mess. They can create problems. So, for example, all the fruit will fall on the ground and they'll rot, and you'll have a lot of wasps, and they create mess and all that. Whereas the extensive fruit trees, things like service berries are one of my absolute favorites for people in North America. And if you don't get to the fruit, no big deal. The birds will get most of it, or it'll fall on the ground and it'll disappear. You'll have seeds next year. That's it. You'll have seedlings, but you can dig up and sell those plants.
Yeah, they'll self-sow like 10 feet away. Wow, there's one coming up. They're great.
Yeah. So, if you're getting into the business of selling plants, then that can be very handy. So definitely, are great. So those extensive things, I usually let them, like most of my systems will be like those extensive things. And then I could say there's a category right in the middle, which I'd call semi-intensive. And these are fruit trees that still produce big quality fruit in your region, whatever your region is. These are usually different in all different regions. But so things like pawpaws and Asian pears, I mentioned Chojuro Asian pear, they'll grow beautiful grocery store quality fruit, a lot of it, without any spray or intervention. So, if I want to make like an income stream off of fruit, and I don't want to have a spray orchard, then I'm shooting for some of those semi-intensive or the extensive fruits from my region. When it comes to those intensive fruits, like apples in Indiana, apples in a lot of the Eastern Woodland region are so difficult to grow without them being buggy. I do exactly what Noah was saying. Make, plant a few, or do an espalier. Espalier is fantastic. You can prune your fruit trees to be like fence. All the apple trees at Lily House were one espalier. By the way, the correct pronunciation is either you could say espalier or you could say espalier. If that's the pretentious French pronunciation, espalier, or you could say espalier, and that's fine too. It's where you train trees into fences. And the magic of that system is sap flows most quickly through vertical branches in a tree. So if you take a branch and you lay it down, once it hits 90 degrees, very little sap flows through it. So there's very little growth. And that means all the energy goes into the fruit production instead. So you get more fruit. There's a lot of airflow through it. So there's very little in the way of disease issues. you can grow them together so they pleach. Like I was talking about at the beginning of the class, they become one plant, they pleach, so that if the root of one dies, you still keep that variety alive. It's amazing. And then you can graft a new fruit stock to it. You keep these things going for 1,000 years. They're amazing. And you can multi-graft. You can put a bunch of different varieties on one fence. So it's a great system for those intensive fruit trees. Keep them small, keep them managed. That way you can put bags on the fruit, you can put a net over them, and you don't have to spray. So, you know, I use the wedding favor bags, and I use, and I put those on my fruit, and you get grocery store clean quality fruit with those wedding favor bags, but it's limited by your labor. You know, how many fruit are you going to bag? Are you going to bag 10,000 fruit? I'm not. All right. Hey, while we're chatting, Pamela, just 1 second. While we're chatting, could someone find the slideshow for me and share it in the chat again? I changed devices, so I no longer have the chat.
What are wedding favor bags?
Oh, I get silk organza bags, and people are most familiar with them as wedding favor bags. Thank you, Avon. And so people put wedding presents in them. And so I'll post pictures on the Facebook group. You may have seen them of my garden. All the apples and pears have little bags on any of the fruit that I want. And you get those bags on the fruit right after they blossom, and you'll get clean fruit with no spraying.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah, good tip. So yes, let's find that. Does anyone else have thoughts or questions, comments before we continue on?
I'm curious whether Masanobu Fukuoka was, I mean, he was a descendant of generations of farmers. So he must then have known about those little forest enclaves. Although I never heard anybody say that he was explicitly inspired by that, but he had to have known about them. I mean, he had to, that's who he was. He had to have been inspired.
Yeah, you know what he was doing? A lot of what he was doing was just recreating, just with that part of it. The orchard that he had there was a hillside Sarayama orchard, just like probably a lot of his neighbors would have had. He just managed his a bit differently, so he managed his in a wilder way. At that time, a lot of people in his region were being trained in intensive fruit, so got to get the sprays going, got to do all that. And Fukuoka turned his back on all that and did everything wrong. He had an agriculture degree, so he felt empowered to do everything wrong. And it turned out he was actually doing everything right.
Yeah, well, his father was one of the leading farmers in his village. His heritage goes back, God knows how many thousands of years.
Yeah, if you lost me for just a second, I am loading up a slideshow.
I'm also curious whether William Morris specifically was one of the pre-Raphaelites who was interested in the cottage gardens.
Yes, yeah. In fact, I write about him in my book.
Oh wow!
Because
he was also
William Morris.
He was also on many, or maybe you write about this in your book, but in many areas of life, he really saw a lot of flaws in the industrial system. So he did a lot of revival of medieval crafts. Fabulous, unbelievable stuff. You know, brilliant, brilliant.
Yeah, he was one of the direct inspirations for the Cottage Garden revival. He was also, you know, they were very interested in, as you just said, an anti-industrial sort of model, a revival of what they saw as a more just and sustainable way of life. And he was also one of the founders of the English Socialist Party. So he's very interested in social progress and in meeting people's needs. And so, yeah, he directly inspired the Cottage Garden revival, kind of the first idea of us having sustainable gardens, of what sustainable gardening meant.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, I love him. Wow, thank you. Cool.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
By the way, I can't see it anymore. So can you see my screen now? Can you see this?
Yeah.
Some things all these smart evolved systems have in common?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent, thank you. So also, I can't see you raise your hands anymore. So if you do, you'll just have to barge in and speak up and stop me if you have questions. So please do. So just to talk about some of the things that all these systems have in common. One, they're long-term investment streams. So all of these are thinking about long-term management of the land. They're not just thinking about, you know, a job or an income stream like a farm, right? They're thinking long-term about the sustainability of their communities and their ecosystems, their regions. They are based on labor-efficient micro-enterprises. So, you know, think about this, the lifestyle of someone who has apricot, an apricot livelihood in the Hunza Valley. They probably have multiple different jobs that they do over the course of the season. They might, at some point go and grab a wagon and go out and harvest apricots and process the apricots, take some to the market to sell, dry them, turn them into value-added products to sell to a more global market. So, at other times they might gather firewood to sell. So they have little different micro-enterprises. The agroforest system is just this resource that they can go to put in some labor and to make some money off of it. And manage it a little bit at a time. So these are really ingenious, very flexible micro-enterprise systems. People in them usually have multiple flexible income streams. There's an emphasis on value-added products for the most part. So a lot of these will people will go and get apples or apricots and then sell them at the market. There's a big emphasis on like dried fruits, on value-added products, on baked goods and things like that. I heard someone was about to chime in. No? Okay. And so that's a big thing that we could replicate too. And the overall feeling of it is that they are foragers more than farmers. They may do gardening at home and have that as part of their lifestyle, but a lot of their income is you get together with some friends and your family and your kids and you go out into the woods and you pick stuff and then you turn it into stuff, and that's your livelihood. It's a very different paradigm than like annual vegetable gardeners, where they are literally trying to grow and sell, every dollar that they make. When you're forage farming, you are in cooperation with the ecosystem. The forest largely produces this stuff for you, and you go and you collect it and you tend the forest. It's a very different way of looking at it. So I think that this is one of the things that we have wrong with community gardening in the United States. We have the idea of community gardening. We get together, and a lot of times it's very top down again. We think everybody has to put in X amount of hours, and you somehow decide to share the resources, and somebody's in charge, somebody's the boss, or maybe you get like one little 8x10 bed for yourself, which just doesn't make any sense in terms of the amount of time and effort it takes to put into that for how much land you get back. And it's all focused on these, annual vegetables and stuff. These systems we're talking about tonight are much better models for how we could be doing community-based, communal permaculture gardening for the future. These folks got these systems right. So commons management, individual enterprise. These systems all have high biodiversity. They're all based on polyculture, uneven spacings. They usually use marginal land. They're valued for their ecosystem services and their community character. They're uneven age stands. We'll talk about that in a second. And they're based on extensive tree crops, right? So they're easy things to grow. All these systems, they're not growing stuff that takes spraying to do. The stuff that would require spraying and be buggy, that's not the stuff they decided to grow. They grew the easy stuff. Brilliant. Okay. So another traditional system, and we're going to talk about this more. I'm looking at the time, it's 8:22. I want to do a bit of an exercise or chat about some things and choosing tree crops tonight. So we're not going to get into this edible tapestry hedge design a lot tonight. But when we get to the polycultures class, we're going to go into a lot more detail on designing these systems. And we have great models again. If you want a really geeky book on these, you could find Georg Mueller's European Field Boundaries. It's a huge 2-volume set that talks about all the historic plant species and everything and documents those. You still have to go through. I wish he did it as a historian instead of as a gardener. I really wish he had documented plant spacings in these systems as well, and given us something like this. So this is the hedge, the mighty hedgerow at Lily House is based on this. And it's modeled after a very traditional European style of hedge. So in some of the pictures we saw above, this exact system probably was in those. So very, again, very super efficient, very easy to maintain systems. We'll talk about them more when we talk about polycultures and guild design. Just a few last concepts here. And to answer Noah's question from earlier, there are a few books on the topic, but there are none that I like yet. I think probably if I don't get around to writing it, somebody else will probably write it in the next couple of years. I know there's a lot of talk about hedgerows and hedges and tapestry hedges in the movement right now. So somebody's going to write that book. So it's going to be a good one when whoever does it. So even-aged monoculture versus uneven-aged polyculture. These are two classic forestry terms. And this is really interesting to me. This shows us the big difference between what we're doing in permaculture and what is generally being done in more mainstream versions of gardening. because a friend of mine is taking a forestry course right now, and the forestry course offered by University Extension was what basically said, even aged stands are the way to go. They're good. That's what we do, and that's good forestry best practice. And they said the drawback of uneven aged stands is that that they can hurt the value of the lumber. And it's just a very different perspective. So to talk about that, so these are two major forestry development terms. Even age stands are where we plant out an orchard all the same year and have all the same age trees. And uneven age stands are where you plant out trees at different intervals and harvest trees at different intervals. So you always have mixed ages and sizes of the trees, right? So these are two different forestry practices. Yes, in permaculture these days, in regenerative agriculture especially, we do have some people making even aged stands. Excuse me, but mostly what we're going for is uneven aged stands of woods and agroforest systems. So there are some major reasons why. Even age stands have far less biodiversity. In fact, it's like a quarter or less. Even uneven aged stands of forests planted by humans have identical levels of biodiversity or higher than wild forests do. Whereas even age stands have less biodiversity, like a quarter of the biodiversity of a wild forest. So that's one of the big reasons why we're aiming always for uneven age stands. And this gets to, we'll talk next time about how this changes how we manage the forest. Even age stands are implicated in erosion and landslides, whereas uneven stands reduce erosion. Even age stands are implicated in fires, whereas uneven age stands increase fire resilience and stand health. And this is a big issue right here. Even aged stands are the only type considered profitable for industrial forestry. Now, think about that. If we're trying to create projects that will last a long time, we don't want them to be attractive to industrial foresters to buy our land and clear cut it. So we want to make uneven age stands because they're more resilient to the destructive forces of unhinged capitalism, to put it that way.
There is, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay, because there is, there's a, Winona LaDuke comes from, I don't remember what tribe, it's in kind of the north, and they managed their forests for millennia, variegated, they harvest, they're very selective in how they harvest, and their yields are very, very high. I believe that they are directly competitive or even better than the yields of commercial forests. I mean, that's, somebody should really, I don't know, or close. I mean, because she is making the point that what kind of like, what are you doing with the even age forests? I mean, she goes a lot further than Susan Samar does in that regard. It's amazing. A Menominee, that's it.
Yeah, you're 100% right. By the way, I saw her speak twice. She's amazing.
Oh God!
And
she ran for vice president, doesn't it? Oh,
yeah,
God, wouldn't we?
Yeah, that's when I saw her. Yeah.
Yeah.
That ages ages me there. So yeah, 100% correct. And that's this last thing here. They're not profitable for industrial harvest because industrial harvest relies on having a bunch of cheap labor that you hire as a one-off to come and do this, and it's about big equipment and clear cutting and ecological damage, but it's not more productive, as you were saying. Over time, the productivity of uneven stands can be higher, especially on a yearly basis, because you can pull over 50 years, you can continuously withdraw products from the uneven age stand. You can go to it every year and get more stuff out of it.
And it's been there forever. They've been there since
forever.
Who knows when?
Exactly. And over the long scale, the productivity is way higher. And it's better for small landholders. It's better for communities. It's only not better for industrial forestry. So that's one of the reasons why we're trying to create these stands, because they also, are kind of rewiring the economy. If we create these uneven age stands everywhere, it's less profitable for industrial agriculture to go through and clear cut everything.
Plus, it's sustainable in terms of what the trees are doing to provide oxygen and clean air too. So that has a disease prevention, an immunity supporting function.
What 100%. You know what happens to the biodiversity of an even-aged forest stand once you clear cut it? Everything dies. There's no biodiversity. We kill all the biodiversity. In an uneven age stand, there are continuous harvests, and the biodiversity stays high. There's always habitat. So it's just a much better practice.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to give a little bit of space in case anyone has any other thoughts or anything that they want to bring into that. This comes to part of our work as community activists. If we're creating community projects, we want to be tilting them towards these kinds of people-powered, even uneven age stands. And these uneven age stands can also include uses like coppicing. I know there's a bunch of really knowledgeable permaculture people on this group, but I'm going to explain coppicing anyway. So coppicing is when you take a tree and you cut it down in the dormant season, when it's like this time of year, and it comes back as basically a bush. It comes back as a multi-branched tree. So you're looking at a coppice lot here. These are not bushes, they're trees that have been cut down, and then they come back as bushes, basically. Now, with these, you can again selectively harvest the pole wood and the young wood out of these, or you can always harvest the bigger logs and leave the younger wood. There's a lot of different flexibility in how you can harvest coppice. Now, the amazing thing is, every time you cut it, the roots under the ground die back, which sequesters carbon in the soil. So you're continuously sequestering carbon in the soil. And coppice is more productive for fuel wood than standard wood by a huge amount. In fact, in Michigan's climate, 1/3 of an acre of coppice lot can provide on a yearly basis all of the wood to heat an average sized home. And it does so because it sequesters carbon. It can do it in a way that isn't just carbon neutral, it's carbon negative. It actually sequesters more carbon in the earth than it releases into the atmosphere from burning. So we can heat our homes in ways that fight climate change using this ancient technology. And coppice lots are great for biodiversity as well. They can be integrated in to a larger, more diverse forest system to provide a lot of different yields to them. We'll talk about coppice more in the future as well. But these are amazing, simple systems to do. And there are a lot of countries in Europe where there are still people who make their living off of coppice agroforestry. You could search for Ben Law, is one person who's been involved in the permaculture movement, and he does traditional European coppice agroforestry. When we do this on taller trees, it's called pollarding. And this allows us to grow branches and leaf crops, feed wildlife or feed animals, for example, or to make mulch. And we grow them up higher because it's above the browse level. So the deer can't eat all the branches that way. And again, when you cut, it sequesters carbon in the soil, and the trees don't die, and the trees stay healthy for thousands of years. So it's an amazing kind of system to use, compassing and pollarding. And they're not too difficult to figure out, especially compassing. With compassing, you just have to cut the tree at the ground level during the dormant season when all the energy is in the roots, and it will come back as a bush. You've probably done this unintentionally if you tried to cut a weed tree and it came back as a bush. Okay, so those are just some of the systems. I want to talk just a little bit about the profitability of some systems for those of you who want to do this kind of thing on a professional level and communicate with clients about the profitability of systems. But before we do that, does anyone have any last thoughts or questions about any of this material we've covered and talked about tonight? It's a good time to ask any questions.
Is there any sort of systematic way, or, I mean, probably all of us, and many of us had ancestors who, my grandmother was an indentured servant on a big manor house in Sweden, where they probably were practicing some of these things. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're still
something weird is happening on my screen. But I'm just wondering how, if you have suggestions for us to research what our ancestors did.
Anytime. Can you see this now? Is the screen back?
Yes.
Okay. You could always ask me. I'm pretty knowledgeable about some of the local systems. And they're getting to be more and more resources out there and available for us. Some of it is just a bit of sleuthing. I'm very interested in the topic, so if you ever want to chat with someone about it, you can chat with me about it. And a lot of the systems were pretty similar, say, in Europe, and a lot of systems were similar in Asia. But and getting in touch with people back home, getting in touch with people who may still be doing it there. Here we've got Facebook, so you might be able to join a Facebook permaculture group in whatever country you're talking about, and chat with people there.
Yeah. There's a guy who's totally into it in Sweden. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, because there are ways in which I just feel that this is in my DNA. There are things that I just am drawn to, just like out of the blue, and then I find out that they were integral to Swedish peasant culture before they made them slaves on manor houses and stuff like that.
Yeah, You know, I love that stuff too, and I think that this is in all of our DNA.
I think so too.
And you know, some of us have started listening to it more than others, but I think that we all have this right in our blood. This is our instinct to make systems just like this. This is right in our basic understanding of how to live in this world.
Yes, I think it is. And I mean, like with my, yeah, well, I don't know, it's kind of detailed. Well, I'll tell you another time. Well, no, I think this is important because I was figuring all this stuff out, and my aunt had Alzheimer's, and I did this whole trip back to visit her, and I brought this book of Swedish peasant art that I showed her, and I told her about, because she thought, oh, my mother was a peasant, and so I just clued her in. No, wait a second. You know, there was wisdom. And so she had Alzheimer's, and 2 days later, she was referring specifically to what I was talking about. She remembered it. So, I mean, also, I just think people are just incredibly bored when they're older. She was sharp as a tack. She got it all. And we stayed awake almost all night talking about this.
One of my grandmothers had dementia as well, and had very little memory. But if you got her to talk about her childhood on the farm, yeah, you could tell you anything about her childhood on the farm.
Yeah, but this was stuff she did not know about.
Oh.
But it was of such passionate interest to her, to hear that her mother was, had this level of respectability that she had never guessed before.
Huh.
She was blown away.
Very cool. Yeah, very cool. Well, I do want to talk about just this one last issue tonight. Tonight has been a lot of lecture, and on Wednesday we'll come back and try to talk a little bit more about choosing tree crops. We're about at 8:43. We don't really have enough time to start that tonight, so we'll finish up this part of me talking at you. Thanks for listening to me. I hope I've said some interesting things. And then on Wednesday, we'll get back and do our workshopping where we'll hopefully talk a little bit more about the actual practical part of choosing our tree crops for projects and helping other people choose them as well. So if projects involve businesses and business viability, then everything we've talked about tonight holds true for that too. We can look at these models and learn a lot from them again. And so these have a lot of wisdom built into these systems. And the way I think about it is they all follow that Pareto curve for labor again. Now, how do you want to spend your time in this world? How do you want to spend your work time? Do you want to spend your work time arguing with people, giving people orders, dealing with labor issues, or do you want to go and play in the woods and harvest things and then turn them into things that make you money, and probably spend a lot less time doing it? So that's what these systems do really well. Now, in March, we have a whole set of classes on financial permaculture and money and making livelihoods. We're going to go into a lot of these concepts in a lot more depth then. But one of the biggest things we need to keep in mind is good farming for as long as right up until the Green Revolution. Good farming has always about making good long-term investments. So if someone is only telling you about their cash flow and how much money they're making per year, what their income is, they're not even farming. They have not figured out what farming is yet. Farming is about the long-term returns and long-term investment. So when agronomists are looking at things, they also look at things this way. So you'll see a lot of systems that look like this. What we're looking at here is a graph of the profitability of apples in Michigan. And Michigan is not a great apple region. Profitability of apples in the Pacific Northwest is higher. In some arid areas, apple profitability is higher than in the Eastern Woodland region. But you see, now these are with a lot of spraying too. So, but what you see is at the bottom, at first, there's a bunch of investment. And then it takes about 7 or 8 years, 7, 8, 9 years before the money starts coming back in. And then it's a few $1,000s a year. Probably for us, realistically, with apples pretty much anywhere in North America, you can expect for industrial scale, maybe $1,000 per acre per year. For a small orchard, probably it's more going to be like $6,000 or $7,000. A small organic orchard, maybe $6,000 or $7,000 a year of profit, of cash flow from folks that I've talked to. It's not a great, apples are not a great investment. So it's, people doing some value added work with them are making better money. There's a great business in Wisconsin called Apple True, and they make historic ciders off of historic apples using historic recipes, and they're amazing. And they've got a historic apple orchard to go with it, and they've got a great business model. But it takes smart stuff like that. But again, the focus on value added products that we see in the Hunza Valley, that we see in the apple walnut forests and so on. So business viability is always about what the long-term projected return is, plus the short-term annual cash flow. But the cash flow is less important than that long-term income, and emphasis on value-added products, and really spreading work around through the season, having micro-enterprises for ourselves. The best permaculture businesses that I'm seeing look just like those Hunza Valley incomes. People have these systems, and they go and they become forage farmers, and they have multiple micro enterprises making value-added products off of them. That's the smart way to do this. In a few months, when we talk about making a living, I'm going to show you dozens of examples of people doing smart businesses like this. For tonight, I just want to add a few more just to give you an overview of what these things look like. So for hazelnuts, in the Pacific Northwest is the biggest, the most profitable region for hazelnuts. Again, on this graph, we see for the first 13 years, it takes about 10 to 13 years to make back the initial investment. It costs about $50,000 per startup per acre. The return is $3,000 to $4,000, maybe $4,500 per year. So, but think about this. So long term, this system pays off. That short term is the really interesting part, because we need cash flow in that area if our businesses are going to be successful. Long term, this business model looks pretty darn good, especially if we also figure in land values. So, but think about this on a small scale. The current market rate for hazelnuts is $13 a pound. Production at low density is about 2,000, 2,500 pounds per acre. So that looks like $26,000 a year, $30,000 a year. I say this because the industrial rate per acre is $3,000, $4,000 a year. But if you can pick hazelnuts at that rate and get them to the market, it's $26,000 a year. So a hazelnut forest, or a forest with a lot of hazelnuts in it, has a lot of potential for microenterprise. $26,000 of potential for microenterprise per year for someone who wants to get those hazelnuts to the market and who can do that and has the market built in. So whenever you're looking at profitability numbers for industrial agriculture, they're not always going to be relevant to us. By the way, best crop ever in North America right now, best fruit crop, best agricultural crop other than medicinals is blackberries. So even under industrial agriculture models right now, blackberries are probably the fastest growing industry because the market on blackberries is crazy good. So $30,000 to $35,000 per acre per year for income on blackberries. So people are doing blackberries like mad all over right now. And of course, they're doing them in unsustainable ways. But if you'd gotten into doing blackberries in a permaculture system a decade ago, you'd be doing really well. Like I know some people who are. So the market rate for blackberries is $6 per pound right now. And the yield is approximately 12,000 pounds per acre. So on a home rate, if you're just going out doing microenterprise and picking, you have about $64,000 per acre of production of potential profit from a blackberry system. For asparagus, it's $3,000 to $5,000. And I mentioned asparagus because you harvest it in the spring. So if you have a system that integrates something like asparagus and brambles and blackberries, you have two different harvest windows, and one can make maybe $50,000 a year, and the other one can make potentially make $60,000 a year. Is it realistic for you to get out and do that? Probably not. But I'd like to say the potential for microenterprises is there if we're smart about how we're doing these things.
I have a quick backtrack question about blackberries. Do you think that it's possible? This isn't something I want to do, but I'm thinking about the person who's freaked out by their blackberries. What about digging them up and selling them to people who want to produce them commercially? That's just a question.
Yeah. With some blackberries, that's possible. The market is really going towards named varieties and improved varieties. So if you just have wild, like Himalayan berries, there's probably not a huge market to sell those plants. And
but the flavor is so much better than what they sell.
Nobody here is going to buy blackberry plants because everybody here is trying desperately to get rid of their blackberry plants.
Yeah,
I know, but they taste so much better than what I buy. It's crazy. And flavor usually means nutrients. So just
your wild plants must taste better than ours because ours are, full of worms for one thing, always, and they tend to be small and they're either way overripe when you pick them, which makes them sweet and they burst immediately, or they're underripe and they're super, super sour. Like the Himalayans around here are, you can eat them, they're fine, but they're not great.
Yeah. Well, good luck with them. Yeah. I'm in Portland, Oregon. The berries are, berries and apples in the Willamette Valley. Big deal.
Yeah. Well, I hate to interrupt an actual discussion in this class where I've just been talking at you the whole time, but I just want to get in a couple last things just for you to think about. agroforestry with black walnuts. So when we calculate like agroforestry for black walnut systems, we're thinking about long-term investment for the property and the real estate returns per acre and watching the real estate appreciate. So we figure that in. And we're talking about, but that says $10 per tree. That's supposed to be a K after there. That's $10,000 per tree in lumber. So as you start harvesting black walnut trees, usually you have to do a few, but I know a group that just harvested 7 black walnut trees from an area for $70,000. It made $70,000. They were doing selective cutting, and they pulled 7 trees out of like a 3-acre site. They did it in a weekend. That's a $70,000 weekend. Black walnuts can be tapped for syrup. So the nuts that they produce as well, on the broadacre industrial is considered to be about $700 to $1,000 per acre for the nuts. That's assuming you're paying for labor and industrial marketing and all that and machinery. So they produce 700 pounds of nuts per acre at low density. Market rate is 10 to 15 pounds. So again, we're looking in the neighborhood of $10,000 a year of cash flow on the nuts, if you can fight the squirrels off of them and actually get the nuts and get them to the market. So it is a reasonable, thinking about all these things together. If we can put together some different foraging incomes and plant incomes throughout the season, we have a lifestyle that looks like the lifestyle of the people in the Hunza Valley. We're doing interesting, diverse things over the course of the year. And with this kind of approach to things, we actually can make reasonable livings off the land. And I know people in the real world who are actually doing exactly this sort of thing and making it work well. It's not what you're seeing on these YouTube channels for profitable farming. It's a very different model, but it's infinitely more sustainable. It's infinitely easier, and it's much more realistic.
Can I say something really quickly about?
I just want to show. Just let me get in one last thing.
Yes,
I just want to
yes. Go.
A red dogwood willow bundle, 60 branches. These are sticks for $40, nearly $1 a stick. And this is actually low in the market value right now. And it's an infinitely sustainable thing. And the crafts made from willow are really high market value added products too. So we have so many options. We're going to talk about dozens of them when we get into the money class. I just like to point all this out. We have so many more options for making these sort of systems work using trees and these historic sort of tree systems as our best models. Oh, right. I've said a whole lot of stuff tonight. If anyone has any questions, has any more comments, I'm going to close this and get back to you all, and we can chat for a few if you want. And if not, I know it's about 9. So I want to say, I'm back. I want to say again, one last time, thank you for joining me. Noah has a question. This is a question I've asked in the past. Could Monet's gardens be an influence on forest gardens? Yes. Giverny is, to me, a beautiful example of a potential forest garden system, especially for someone who wants to have a business selling flowers along with their plants too. It could be a really nice sort of business. So yeah, we could do so much. In a few weeks, we're going to be talking a lot about more different models. I hope that you had a fun little tour of some of the world systems and just to get an idea of what systems are possible for us. Now it's 9 o'clock, so I'm going to say bye to everyone, but I'm going to hang out for a few more minutes in case anyone has questions. Like I see Pamela raising her hand.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm muted or not. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I just want to say bye to everyone who has to go first, and then I'm going to hang out. If you have more questions, it's after class time.
Okay.
Bye, everyone. Thanks again. And now I'll go ahead, Pamela.
Oh, okay. So I was going to say this about black walnut because people freak out about black walnuts and, and we have this ancient black walnut tree in the backyard. It's like about the trunk is 4 feet in diameter. I can't imagine how old that is. And this land used to be a dairy farm at one time. And and I've seen things growing under that black walnut tree that are not supposed to grow under black walnut tree, like blackberries and lilacs. And so I was taking a class from Elaine Ingham, and I asked her specifically whether because it's so fertile under this black walnut tree. So I asked her whether if the soil was fertile and the soil biology was good, is there more latitude for growing things under a black walnut tree that people say you can't grow? I mean, like apple trees are growing up by, seeding themselves under this black walnut, and it's supposed to not work. And she said, yes. She said, if the soil is good and there is good soil biology diversity, you can do a whole lot more than anybody would. You can really push it. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the same time, we could think of the allelopathy as a benefit, because things that might get off control as weeds aren't going to grow underneath the black walnut quite as easily either. So, there's no need to be afraid of it in context. We can do systems that are based on black walnuts, but you do need to get the name varieties that have easier to crack nuts, because those nuts are nuts. Like the first time I ever tried to crack one, like 20 years ago, I finally decided I'm going to eat a black walnut. I'd never eaten one before. I tried to crack it. No way. So I grabbed a hammer and I put it in the crack of a sidewalk, in between two pieces of sidewalk. I put it right on that crack and I whacked that nut with a hammer, and the nut went flying and it cracked the sidewalk and didn't crack the nut.
I think you have to use a vise. I haven't been able,
nutcrackers.
Yeah, I love this tree, and I haven't been able, I've lived here for 10 years and I haven't been able to crack any of those nuts.
Yeah. Yeah, I mentioned it before, but this is dyed with black walnut hulls that are, so we can also use the black walnut hulls to make nocino, a nice dessert drink. It's a nice liqueur. It's a lovely flavor. And you can even dye things with it.
You can make ink with it.
And this is dyed with black walnut too. This is just pine dyed with my own from just harvested black walnut hulls.
Yeah, you can make ink out of them too.
Yeah.
It's easy to do.
Yeah. By the way, we're talking about forest business models. In the folder for today's class, the trees and tree systems folder, you look in that folder, there's a PDF on forestry businesses. And it is fantastic. It's great. Just pointing out that's in there. Hey, Jimmy, nice to see you.
Hi. Yeah, I actually was just kind of going to ask about that. For some context, I'm coming into this course having a background in activism.
Okay, so that was that again was Mike Hoag's Transformative Adventures Permaculture class, and it is the Permaculture design class, I should say. So this is a sneak peek to one of the classes that you would be able to see if you were taking his class. So I mentioned earlier that I have been kind of toying around with the idea of maybe putting together my own permaculture design class, where you would get a permaculture design certificate for going through it. But I want to do it a little bit differently than the way it's been traditionally done online. For one thing, I would stream it, of course. Most of the time, if classes are streamed, they're done over Zoom. I would put it out to the public. That would be my idea, to make the information available to everyone, whether or not they're getting a certificate. But of course, participants in the class would get priority with questions. I would be able to bring them on screen as well. And of course, they'd get a certificate in the end. So that would be their big benefit for joining the class, more so than just following along online. But then beyond that, classes tend to run, I think the typical class is about $720. And that's about $10 per hour. The requirements to get a permaculture design certificate is a 72-hour class on permaculture. So I feel that's a reasonable price. However, I want to make this as accessible as possible. So my idea would be then to make it a pay what you will sort of a deal. So if you can pay that full price, that you know, I would leave in the suggested amount of $720. But if you can't quite make that much, then pay what you're able to, and that way I feel it would really open up permaculture to a large group of people that have been excluded due to monetary reasons. Yeah, I know it was hard for myself when I first went through my PDC back in 2016. I had to pay in installments because I didn't have all that money up front. And I believe I paid a reduced rate as well. I had like an economic driven sort of thing, but still it was a hardship for me. But anyway, if that's something that you might be interested in doing, pursuing a permaculture design certificate, let me know in the comments. You can go either to the Facebook version of this video or the Twitter version of this video or the YouTube version, and in any of those places you can leave a comment. So go right ahead and do that. I'll put in, let's see now. Let me go to the chat here. I think I have it set up. Let me just test it. I believe I have it set up so it will give you the YouTube link if I just hit YouTube. Let's see if it works. There we go. So check out the YouTube link there. You can leave a comment on this video if that's something you might be interested in doing. And who knows, maybe I can get a full business going off of it at some point. That would be absolutely tremendous. A great extra source of income. And way to spread these ideas even further and wider. Yeah, just let me know. All right, I think that's going to do it for tonight. Our next stream is going to be on Wednesday. Going to be continuing on with Alexander Berkman's The ABC of Anarchism, also known as What is Communist Anarchism, around 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock Central Standard Time. Round about those times is when we'll be doing that. Otherwise, I hope to see you on the next Sunday show. And I don't know what I'm going to do for that one yet. So if you have any suggestions, put that in the Discord. Put up the link for the Discord right now. There we go. Join the Discord right there. That's right. I take all the links and suggestions for the show. And it's a place where you can continue the conversation. That's another place you can let me know if you'd be interested in taking a PDC from myself. Yeah, that'll do it for tonight then. Anyway, let's raid into someone. Let's see who's on right now. Hey, Radical Disability is on. Let's raid them. That sounds really good to me. I always enjoy their input. Wherever you're finding this, if you'd like another cool streamer to follow, go ahead and check out Radical Disability. I'll put the link right there in chat. And we'll begin the raid shortly. Thank you all for joining me, and I really hope to see you all Wednesday.